welcome, friends. It's great to see all of you here for our, September virtual salon on October 1st. For our September selection, John Cassidy's Capitalism and Its Critics. Pete and I are delighted that Cassidy is here to join us today. And Pete, as usual, will have some questions for him. And then we, of course, will open the floor to all of you for your questions. And also, as always, Shelley will be monitoring the chat as we go through our hour or so together, and she'll capture any links or comments and so forth that appear there, and we will share it all with you in the LF portal shortly after the conclusion of our session today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming John Cassidy. And Pete, I turn things over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Amy. I'm really thrilled to get this chance to talk with John Cassidy. He is a writer of economics and politics for many years at The New Yorker. He's the author of a book called How Markets Fail, which is a logic of the examination of the sort of intellectual arguments about the relationship to markets failing. And he is also, in related to that, did this fantastic set of interviews after the global financial crisis with the different Chicago representatives of the Chicago School of Economics that is available through the New Yorker as well, that I highly recommend everyone to look at. I think this book, just as a short thing, is I really picked this book because I think it is the best one-stop shop examination of the intellectual history of the critics of capitalism. It's important to understand this set of arguments. John Maynard Keynes, in his decisive break from classical economics, referred to that he was going to reach back into the history of economics and find the various thinkers from Malthus to Major Douglas to all kinds of people who were different from, say, Say's law kind of approach. And this book gives us a window into all of those different theorists, not just the macro people, but everyone from, the criticisms of the mercantilist capitalist system to the criticisms of slavery, and then Marx, and all the way up through to today being the criticisms of globalization and inequality and other things. So I think, John, just to start, you've done an amazing job, and a job of created a book that I will try to use in my teaching for probably as long as I keep teaching now. And so I'm really thrilled to get a chance to talk to you. So thank you for coming in here. My first question to you is simply that you covered markets and politics for decades. What made you decide to write a history of capitalism through its critics rather than, say, like a conventional economic history of our moment? Also, just as a back to that, there was many seismic events that went on during the time that you decided to write the book and it's published. And did any of that have any kind of background to the way that you decided to approach the topic?
Okay, Pete. Well, thanks very much. First of all, I'd like to just say thanks very much for inviting me to address your salon, book club, whatever it is, and for your kind words about my book. I spent a long time writing it and researching it, so it's very gratifying that people from various sort of parts of the economic debate find it useful. That's been one of the most welcome responses I've had to it, that seems to be people on the left, center, and right seem to find something valuable in it. So that at least suggests to me that I didn't waste my time for the last 10 years researching and writing this book. Anyway, how did it come about? I've already said it's 10 years. As you said, my last book was about the financial crisis, basically, and the sort of intellectual arguments about free markets in the context of finance, largely. The idea for this book came to me in the 2016 election, which I covered for the New Yorker. During the primaries, as you'll recall, Bernie Sanders was running from the left with a critique of capitalism, which I think was a familiar one. From the right, Trump was running with a critique of capitalism. It's not often forgotten that he actually ran as a sort of insurgent at the time, attacking Wall Street and the bankers, and big corporations were moving their operations offshore. So it seemed to me, looking back historically, that this was actually a very unusual moment to have a sort of critique from the left and the right in a mainstream presidential election. I certainly couldn't remember any parallels. Obviously, if you go back to Reagan, there were critiques. There have been critiques from either side of the sort of prevailing model of capitalism, but the fact that it was from both sides to me seemed to be something really novel, or at least I couldn't think of any examples since the 1930s. So I thought there must be a book. It seemed to be like a sort of emerging crisis of legitimacy of the system we hadn't sort of experienced for a century to me. So I thought there must be a book somewhere in explaining how this came about and how we got here. And I originally thought I'd start the book after the end of the Cold War and sort of take the debates from there on. But then I realized that after a while, I realized this is just going to be another history of neoliberalism. And, not exactly novel ground. Lots of other people have written books, some good, some bad, some indifferent, on that subject. And so I thought maybe I don't have that much value to add there. But also, as I started to research the sort of critiques, if you go into the Bernie's critiques or Trump's, you find that you really have to go into history, but to explain how they come about. If you want to critique neoliberalism, you have to explain how neoliberalism came about. So you have to go back into the crisis of the Keynesian system, post-war Keynesianism. Then you say, well, how did Keynesianism come about? And it takes you back to the obviously to the Great Depression and the Second World War, and then how did the Great Depression, there's sort of an infinite recursion goes on. So I thought, eventually I came to the idea that maybe I should just start from the beginning with the rise of industrial capitalism. And that meant it was a much larger book and a much more ambitious project than I originally started out with, but it also gave it a certain cohesion and a narrative frame. So I eventually decided to, I'd had a second stage where I thought maybe I'll start with Engels in Manchester and the sort of rise of the factory system. But I thought that was a bit arbitrary. So I took it back another 100 years to the East India Company and Adam Smith. So that seemed to be a more natural starting point, because I am from the north of England. I'm from Leeds, which was one of the great first industrial cities. Manchester obviously was the first one, but Leeds has arguments to be the second one. The woolen textiles was the basis there. So that's where the idea came from, and obviously it was a monument. I basically at that stage I'd committed to writing a sort of intellectual history of the last 250 years. So how do you narrow it down? And I always admired Bob Heilbronner's book on the worldly philosophers. I met Bob when I first came to New York 40 years ago. And I always thought that was a very useful introduction for non-economists and even economists, because most economists don't get taught any intellectual history anymore. So I just thought it was a very readable framework, doing it through particular individuals, sort of mixing biography with history and sort of the actual economic arguments. So I sort of adopted that as a template, and that's how the book came about. At the end, it had sort of expanded, and I think there's like 28 chapters. There's probably like 25 or 26 devoted to individuals, and there's 2 or 3 collective chapters, like on the dependency theorists in Latin America and on the critiques of globalization more recently. As you get into more recent history, it's hard to sort of say who's going to be the most important figure in another 50 years. So rather than picking one critic of globalization, I did a handful of them. That's how the book came about. And as you say, lots of things have happened since 2016, but I think they just reinforce the idea that it was a sort of break with history, especially when Trump got reelected. I pretty much finished the book by the end of 2024, so I was only able to add in a few thoughts on the significance of that. If it comes out in paperback, I think I'll address that in more depth. But that was where the book came from, basically.
So, John, this is a little too insider baseball of academic scholarship, but I'm going to give you some words of praise again, which is that in recent years, in the field of history of economic ideas, there's been a real strong emphasis on social history.
Right.
A large part of the social history is more or less about the social history of the thinker rather than the social history in which they're living.
Right.
One of the things that I found really fascinating about your book is the way that you weaved the problems that face people in their social milieu at the time, and how they reasoned their way through it, and weaving that back and forth, and that was really, I think it's a fantastic piece of scholarship. So,
thank you very much. I guess on that, I would say, I studied history and economics, 40 odd years ago in Oxford now. And I did do a sort of special subject on social and sort of ideological history on Britain. Basically, I wrote a thesis on neoliberalism in the late 19th century. And John Hobson actually figured in it to some extent,
Yeah.
although it's broader than that. And so I guess that also was a sort of, a help. I don't know. That's just how I think of things. I guess I'm not au courant with the latest historiography, but I think individual. When you're a journalist, the first thing they teach you is writing about people attracts readers. I mean, it's very hard. I could have written, just a history of ideas, or I could have just written a history of capitalism. I think both of those things are valuable in themselves, but it's very difficult to get readers to plow through a fight who don't have to do it for a course to plow through a 500-page book on that. So, and as I said, I thought Bob Heilbrunn had a sort of good model to follow there. So I'm glad you thought it worked out. I did try and sort of keep the balance between biography, social and political history, and the sort of economic arguments they were presenting. I mean, I don't think history is physics. I don't think you can present it out. I mean, sorry, economics is physics. I don't think you can present it out, although obviously it has some independent scientific content, but I don't think you can present its development outside the context in which it came about.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, did a fantastic job. Now, related to that, we in this group, this is we're sponsored by Liberty Fund, and so Adam Smith's writings are a key part of everything we've done here. And so our group has talked quite a bit about the wealth of nations and the theory of moral sentiments. So I imagine that when we get to the Q&A, we might get some questions about that. But so Smith is often celebrated as capitalism's defender. But you also remind us that he was a critic of mercantilism and monopoly power, cronyism, we might call it today.
Right.
Do you think Smith himself belongs in the traditions of capitalism's critics, or is he a more radical critic of the power and privileges of the mercantilist elite, so that it's more like the thwarting of the system of natural liberty rather than the replacement of the system of natural liberty?
Right. Well, I think I'd say both, right? I mean, obviously, I'm being a bit provocative writing a chapter about Adam Smith in a history of critics of capitalism. Yeah. When I first went to Washington in the 1980s, all the Republican free marketeers used to wear the Adam Smith badges. The Adam Smith Society was huge in the Reagan years, you remember. Okay. So obviously, I was being a bit provocative, but I do think this is a history of critics of capitalism in their own time, and I think Smith was a critic of mercantile capitalism, obviously. Yeah. I know there's great historiographical debate about whether mercantilism can be classed as capitalism. I didn't want to get into that. It seemed to me it just so obviously is a type of capitalism. The East India Company was a joint stock company which had operations all over the world. I mean, it was a modern multinational company in some ways, and Adam Smith was a great critic of it. He rewrote The Wealth of Nations, second edition or third edition. He wrote a new chapter because he thought he hadn't written enough. He had some criticism of the East India Company in the first edition, but he didn't think that was sufficient. And there was huge debates in the 1870s in England and Britain about what to do about it, because the company had gone bankrupt and been bailed out. It was a sort of 2008 or a 1770s version of the 2008 bailouts. So I wanted to sort of point out that in his own context, Smith was a critic of capitalism, just as Hayek, in the 20th century, was a critic of Keynesian capitalism. Keynesianism is the mixed economy is a form of capitalism. Most of the economy was still in private hands, and Friedman and Hayek were, obviously they're great defenders of the free market, were critics of the capitalism of their day. And this is a history, so I thought that they all deserved a place in this. In terms of how I would, obviously, in the whole scope of things, sure, Adam Smith's primary importance is as a defender of free markets and competition. But in defending free markets and competition, obviously natural liberty and the theory of moral sentiments, I didn't really get into that. I focus mainly on the wealth of nations. But I think if you say, well, if Smith came back today, what would he think of capitalism today? I don't think he'd be a great defender of the sort of internet monopolies. I think so. It's a two-sided thing. I see Smith as a defender of a sort of, I guess, 19th century British capitalism, the sort of free market, free trade, relatively small scale production, diminishing marginal costs. So the actual market in that context works pretty much as you see it in a neoclassical textbook, but it doesn't have much to do with today's economy of zero marginal costs.
Yeah.
And huge combines everywhere.
Yeah, he has that great letter, in his correspondence where he's writing to, and he refers to the wealth of nations. I think the exact quote is an aggressive assault on all of British commercial life or something like
Exactly,
that. Yeah.
exactly. He certainly viewed himself as a critic. So I
Yeah.
think, it's perfectly legitimate to present him in that context. But as I say, I'm not saying he was obviously most of the people in the book are left-wing critics, because over the centuries that most of the critiques of capitalism have come from the left.
Yeah.
But I wanted to include some conservative thinkers. I also included Carlyle, who
Right.
represented a different branch of conservatism, a much more sort of feudal branch in some ways.
Yeah.
And
He's a little more unsavory,
or
to put it bluntly.
yeah,
One of the things that I found fascinating in your book, and I put it up on X, was the this comes later on, and I don't know if I'll ask you about, but was Paul Sweezy and then eventually Joan Robinson's, critique of basically hydraulic Keynesianism or
yeah,
bastard Keynesianism, and in Joan Robinson's case, the kind of military Keynesianism,
yeah,
which actually resonates with a lot of libertarian thinkers as well. And so you're
sure.
reading it and you're like, oh my God, look at this. Like there's these parallels that we can join in on. So um, that's one of the reasons why I think that, again, the book has so much information and detail and very good arguments on that.
Thanks.
Let me get to Keynes and Polanyi a little bit, because Keynes, as you note, this sees himself as breaking with the lineage of classical and early neoclassical economics. And he found forerunners that could be listed in your critics of capitalism, at least skeptics of the invisible hand and laissez-faire.
Right,
But at the same time, in your chapters, both Keynes and Polanyi are really a kind of about managed capitalism. They're the
right.
efforts to fix it and manage
Yeah.
it rather than to replace it. And they see the state as the crisis manager. What do you think the concept of pure capitalism is just like a mythology?
Yeah, I mean, I do actually. I mean, I
Yeah.
think both in the foundation of the system, I mean, the state, if you just go back to the Enlightenment, you needed a state to establish property rights and, security of contract, etc. I think without the state, it's anarchy, right? I mean, even Nozick accepted that. He had a role for the state in enforcing property rights and things. So I think the state plays an essential role in the rise of capitalism. But I think over the centuries, one of the main reasons capitalism has survived and prospered is because the state at various points has intervened to sort of, curb it of its excesses. And I see that in the 1930s, especially with the rise of Keynesianism. And Polanyi is slightly different because in the 30s, Keynes was a liberal. He was a pro-capitalist. He invested in the markets. He was basically a Victorian liberal, late Victorian liberal. Polanyi is a different case because he came out of Eastern Europe and had a darker view of the world than Keynes. And actually, in the 1930s, when he left Vienna, when the fascists took over, he wrote a series of papers, most famous, obviously, for the Great Transformation, which he wrote a decade later. But if you go back to the 30s, he was writing papers about whether capitalism could survive at all. He had one which I detail in the book called Fascism or Socialism, and in which he made the argument that the center cannot hold the only logical outcome of allowing sort of free market capitalism, which is how he thought what happened in the interwar period, to sort of be untrammeled, was until it would lead to one of the extremes, either fascism or socialism. Subsequently, as you say, he sort of modified that in the Great Transformation. He actually became a big fan of Roosevelt, FDR, when he moved to the US. And for at least a decade, he then became what I would call more of a sort of Keynesian social democrat. He eventually sort of lost faith in that model as well, and took a darker view again. But so, yeah, I think Polanyi and Keynes obviously are two central figures. I mean, when I grew up, I didn't really learn about Polanyi. I grew up in the British Keynesian tradition. All my tutors in Oxford and were Keynesians. And you sort of, you imbibed it just like the water. And much as in a lot of American schools, you imbibe sort of neoclassical economics like the water. So but I thought in recent decades, and especially in the last decade or so, I've come to have more of a sort of a recognition of the importance of Polanyi as well, as taking a broader sort of political economy approach, and the idea, I think his double movement thesis that if capitalism untrammeled inevitably produces a counter reaction, the double movement, is a very sort of profound argument, and I think we've basically seen that. How I would interpret the current situation is we're basically suffering the sort of consequences of the double movement against the great sort of neoliberal experiment, and it's just not clear how it's going to come out yet. But that's how I think it gives you a way of thinking about it at least. I mean, you might not.
That's how you would explain the.
Well, I think it's a way of
backsliding and the rise of populism and whatnot around the world. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, I'm not sure. Obviously, it's a bit reductionist, but if you're looking for a big sort of framework, I think it's useful useful way of thinking about things.
I mean, when you look at the data right now about democratic backsliding, it's scary as hell, right? I mean, in terms of, what we had in terms of the movement towards democracy, and now movements away,
right. Well, I think pretty much everybody from the sort of center right to the center left of my generation, your generation, we thought that democracy and capitalism went together naturally, to some extent. And, there were critics on the extreme left who didn't believe that, obviously, the Marxists, and there were critics on the right who didn't believe it. And I mean, they're sort of having their day now, right? Because it seems that they had a point.
Yeah.
Around the world. Yeah. 1 second, I just let my dog out. Come on.
Yep.
I have a very needy dog.
We always approve of tending to the animals.
Yeah. Just two more questions, and then we'll get everyone else in here. So for those who are here, remember, just use the raise hand function and you get on and do that. But the question I wanted to ask you was, it follows up on what you just said. So maybe you've already answered it. But you give the critics a lot of, you even give it like a little bit of rhetorical flourish, you give them their words. So capitalism is soulless, it's exploitive, it's inequitable, it's unstable, and so we have all these arguments. And there is something that's enduring, that the same argument that was made, by Engels is in some sense also being made by, Danny Roderick or something, all these years later. And so, after spending all these years with these critics, Marx, Keynes, Luxemburg, Robinson, Polanyi, or so many others, has your own view of capitalism shifted at all? Or do you find yourself sort of, still finding the same arguments that you might have found when you were at Oxford, resonating with you still today?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say I'd still categorize myself on the center left. But I think if you've lived through the last 30 or 40 years, I think what it has taught me, and doing this book obviously reinforced it, is that some of the arguments from the extremes are stronger than I thought they were. I mean, if you took a Keynesian view of the world, which I did for a long time, you basically thought that if you got aggregate demand right and you kept unemployment low and you had a generous social safety net, things would go pretty well. And it did seem to go pretty well for 30, 40 years after the Second World War. Now, some of the early Keynesians from the left who I write about, who you mentioned, Kalecki and Joan Robinson and Sweezy. Sweezy was a Marxist, obviously. They very early on said this system wasn't sustainable, and their basic argument was that the forces of capital would rebel against it because they didn't. Keynesianism gives obviously a central role of the old school Keynesianism to labor and labor movement, and that would eventually crimp both profits and the sort of right to manage. So the Treaty of Detroit in the American contract text wasn't sustainable in the long term, was their argument. And Kalecki actually wrote an article saying that in 1942, 1943, which was incredible, really. So I I was vaguely aware of those arguments when when I was a student, however long ago. But being a journalist and just following the history, I've had one of the great things about being a journalist. I've been very privileged to have a sort of front row seat of the evolution of capitalism, global capitalism, in the last 40 years. And I think, if you've followed it closely, as I'm sure all your colleagues have, those critiques just seem they ring home, right? I mean, it's the problem with Keynesian isn't that monetary or fiscal policy is difficult, although we can make the argument it's more it's maybe monetary policy isn't as powerful as and fiscal policy isn't as easy to manipulate as the original hydraulic Keynesians thought. But everybody basically accepts that Keynesianism works in a crisis, and everybody's a Keynesian in the bunker, as the saying went in the great financial crisis. The problem with the system is the more fundamental problem is how you sort of arrange the political economy of it, how you maintain a system of what I call managed capitalism. And I think I've become more and more aware of that over the years.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, just on your point about
I'm more pessimistic about it, to be honest. I mean, I try to be optimistic, but I'm less optimistic than I used to be.
So just two things on that. One is on your point about everyone being a Keynesian. There is no atheist in a foxhole kind of thing, right? There is this, obviously Nixon said we're all Keynesians now, which was a huge thing. But also Reagan, after the '87 crisis, sort of makes concessions, even though he says Mr. Keynes didn't know economics or something like that. He still goes on and does that. So it is kind of intriguing what you just said about that. This issue that you made about the shared growth, I don't know if you're aware of this, but you should probably interview him. Darren Acemoglu is writing a new book on the remaking of liberalism.
Right. Yeah, and I interviewed him a while ago about AI. I did.
Yeah, when he had that. So now he has this other book, which he's doing, which is on remaking liberalism, in which he's trying to get back. And one of the core ideas is this shared prosperity.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
yeah. And so it's a conversation a lot of people are having.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to point out also on the right too. If you talk to people like Oren Cass and the American Compass folks, I mean, obviously they go about it a different way, but they're adopting my framework, they are sort of advocating a form of managed capitalism from the right, I would say. Obviously protectionism, and some of them are even, talking about universal basic income if necessary. So it's a bit like you said before, how the sort of arguments from the right and the left converge in some ways. And I think that's couldn't have been
tell you
years ago.
A funny, like a little funny story I had, and I want to see your reaction to it because this relates to your pessimism. So I was at a conference with Brad DeLong. He hadn't yet published his Slouching Towards Utopia, but the argument was there. That's what he was always presenting. And we started talking about different things. And he was criticizing neoliberalism because he says, look, you have to remember that it always takes place within the brine of politics. In the brine of politics. And I turned to him and I said, that's true. I mean, I'm a public choice guy, right? So, I mean, I said, of course, that's true. I said, but that's true for Keynesianism as well. Right. This is why I found the criticisms of Sweezy and Robinson so attractive.
Right.
It's like, and he was like, how so? Like, in his mind,
I mean, I think, hydraulic Keynesianism, there was, I mean, the critique of it, I think the one from the right, which has the most heft, is that, there's government failures as well as market failures. And, I think you have to just face that head on. I'm a big advocate of government, but you have to accept that in some areas there can be government failures too, and how you deal with that. And in the US especially, where there's so little faith in government, I think that's a sort of central question facing progressives.
Yeah. All right. Last. I mean, that's going to be the big question, even like the Ezra Klein and the abundance people have, right? Because if you think about their idea, basically you're assuming that government is publicly interested and then they'll do all the good things that they want. I'm in favor of many of the programs that they claim on, building, energy development and stuff like that. But, the question is who benefits at whose expense? Let's get to the last question, which is, as you end the book, you deal with a lot of the crisis stuff today, the AI, but also or potential disruptions of AI. the monopolistic power of the platform economies, climate change, whatnot. Among all the historical figures, I know that you said that you grouped them because you can't tell who's going to be, the
Right,
thinker that made the most. But as you're thinking about it, and you wanted a young person to sort of become like the next articulate defender of the critics and
right,
offer for reforms. Were there any one of the thinkers that you could imagine yourself? You've written
right,
two New Yorker columns, one on Hayek, the age of
right.
Hayek, and another one on Marx, what Marx still
Yep.
teaches us. I remember those two very good ones.
Right. Yeah. No.
Can you imagine you would do that for the 21st century?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say anybody studying economics should study both of them, to be honest. I
Yeah.
mean, I think, I mean, that column I wrote on Marx was in 1998 when I called him a sort of, I think, the next big thinker. I still think, I didn't do it when I was a student, but I still think at some point, if you're writing about capitalism or thinking about economics, you should actually confront Marx and the arguments, because just for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's pretty stunning when you read the sort of Communist Manifesto and the sort of the passages about globalization and technical progress. I mean, I always thought, and Marx and Engels, before I started studying them, were just blanket critics of capitalism, and they didn't see anything positive in it. But actually, if you read, and Schumpeter actually got a lot of this stuff from Marx, I think, through creative destruction, basically. You see that if you read Capitalism, Social and Democracy. First chapter is all about Marx. And the actual creative destruction, I would say, came out of Marx. So I think globalization, the passages in the Communist Manifesto about the bourgeoisie remaking the entire world in its likeness, etc. That was just centuries ahead of its time. And then the central critique of the sort of distributional question. You have to, if you're going to defend the system, you have to have a convincing, counter argument to that, I think. And it seemed like that had gone away for a century, but obviously in the last 30, 40 years, we see that, there's a reason it's in power, right? I mean, there's a reason why the right is in the ascendance, and it's a lot to do with the sort of how the globalization has reshuffled things.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for addressing my questions. We're now going to turn to our readers. So, Taylor, you have the floor.
Hi, John. I really enjoyed your book.
Oh, thank you.
Even went back and picked up How Markets Fail, and I'm working through that one too. It came up just a few minutes ago in the conversation, the idea of public choice and government failure as compared to market failure. That public choice theories and ideas are relatively new compared to some of the ideas you covered in your book.
Yeah.
And yet it seems to me that there's some pretty convincing evidence that government failure can be as bad as or worse than different types of market failure, or the government may not be in a position to correct some of the market failures. As these arguments have been made and public choice has kind of become more mainstream, has that changed your thinking at all about,
well, as I said, I think you
reform and what can and should be done?
I would say, yeah. I mean, I try to, when I studied economics as an undergraduate, as I said, in like 1980, 81, the public choice was just coming into vogue then, and we did read some of it, but yeah, I mean, obviously, I think if you're going to propose a sort of managed capitalism, as I sort of advocate, you do need to take into account the critics of what failed last time, and obviously interest groups seizing the government, things like that. They're all important. I mean, in the context of this book, I mean, it's a book about critics of capitalism, not critics of government. I mean, I think somebody could write a good history of critics of government. It's just a different book. But so my sort of the book isn't a political tract. The last chapter, because people expect at the end of 500 pages you to lay out some sort of what do you think. So I in the last chapter I have some sort of discussion of where things may be heading and what the various political models, political economic models on offer are. But I look at public choice more as a sort of a critique rather than as a positive here's another model. It's a sort of, I think it's a bit subject to the same critique as Marxism. Marxism is a very powerful critique of capitalism, but it doesn't really tell you what the replacement should be. I mean, public choice I see as a sort of powerful critique of government, but there are still market failures. There are still big problems. How do you what's the solution? And perhaps I'm just ignorant of the public choice literature, but I don't think it's. Is it fair to say it's not as strong on the prescriptions as the analysis?
Yeah. I have a quick question, just a bit biographically to you. When you were at Oxford, was there any discussion of IEA, or was IEA like not?
No, sure. No, I mean that was right in the middle of the monetarist experiment. So we used to read IEA pamphlets. Sure. I mean, all the Friedman stuff was all put out by the IEA.
Right.
England. Yeah. I think they were the first person to turn his presidential lecture on inflation and unemployment into a pamphlet in the UK, and they put out monetarism and the IEA were basically very closely associated.
Yeah. Victoria?
Hi, John. Sorry, having a bit of a cough. So I love the breadth of your, critics. They're just so many, and so many different aspects of criticism are tackled over a large time frame. And when you set it up like that, with all these different people, it just starts to come to feel like the critics are actually part of the system, not on the outside of the system. They come, child labor is no longer acceptable. Our norms have changed. We can afford for our kids to go to school now, so we're going to work that into the system. And as you progress, so in a sense, I feel like this is a very optimistic book because it really highlights capitalism's propensity to be dynamic and respond and evolve and change. And so I guess that's the first part of my question is these folks aren't outsiders, they're insiders. They don't leave the system. They were raised for the most part in a very elitist system themselves. Even Marx is supported by the surplus capital from Engels's factories. So it's like they don't exit. Joan Robinson comes the closest maybe with her fascination with communism in China, but she doesn't ever leave. So that's part of an observation I'd like you to comment on. And then the second part that struck me as I read through, and I love how many different, I don't know who encouraged you to like all these obscure people, but it's so fun to get new info in here. But it seems like, and I'm going to read your other book too, but transparency is such an essential feature of capitalism. We don't keep two sets of books in capitalism. There's just one, right? And Joan Robinson never would have gotten promoted to her rightful degree if people couldn't have ridiculed her, her contemporaries for not promoting her and giving her a title, which gave her a voice, which made her prominent. And so I just feel like transparency isn't talked about enough, because without transparency and without exposing monopolies, exposing pollution, exposing the wrongs, the critical things, you can't have a functioning system. So just wanted you to comment on that too.
Yeah, well, I think that your points are linked, basically. I mean, one of the points which did come home to me as I wrote the book and researched it is the sort of protean nature of capitalism. And there are various, I mean, in the academia, there's my former tutor in Oxford, David Soskice, wrote a famous book on varieties of capitalism. And if you look back over the centuries, there's been various models. And as you say, the critics do play a role in sort of transferring from one to the other. Like let's go to the 19th century, for example. Marx and Engels, obviously, I would call them outside. Engels, obviously, is a great historical sort of anomaly in that he was a capitalist and a Marxist revolutionary at the same time, which is incredible. But they didn't really have any political power in their own time. I mean, people say, why didn't the British ever arrest Marx? They didn't care about a bunch of German exiles in London. There were only a couple of hundred of them. First edition of the Communist Manifesto was only in German, and maybe 200 people read it. Who knows? So they were outsiders, I would say. But in the long term, I think the role that they played, and not just them, but the sort of threat of, the threat they represented did prompt reform within the system. As you say, the rise of labor unions in the UK, Bismarck's policies in Germany, the original sort of the social insurance state, that was an explicit reaction to the rise of the SPD in Germany, and was basically, look, we've got to give the workers a stake in the system or they're all going to be revolutionaries. And that strategy worked. Keynes, to some extent, the same thing. We've got to, we can't have the economy lapsing into sort of just decades of recession, or, it's going to lead to revolution. You need some way to prop up. Keynes was, as I said, a big defender of capitalism, but he thought he had this potentially fatal flaw in that it could just get stuck and things would spiral down forever, and you need the government to come in and lift things up. And again, that became conventional wisdom. So I think you're right. The critics do play ultimately, capitalism is very adaptable. Anything which can sort of preserve the system will eventually be adopted. So actually, you're not the only person who said that. Quite a few people, especially in the UK, have sort of, on the right, have sort of embraced the book as a sort of as a testimonial to the strength of capitalism, saying, look, here's all these critics this guy's written about over the last 250 years, criticizing this, criticizing that, criticizing the other. But the system has proved itself, capable of withstanding all these critiques, and still is the sort of only model standing. So I think that, sure, one of the central points of the book is that capitalism is, as I said, very protean and can't be reduced to any sort of fixed model. I mean, dynamic change is sort of the essence of the system, both in a technological sense, but also in a sort of political sense, because you always have this sort of Polanyi double movement going on at the same time. So, I mean, one of my chapters on long cycles, and Kondratiev, the Russian economist who Stalin killed, who was the originator of the K-waves. He thought capitalism evolved in, he accepted there were sort of business cycles every 10 or 15 years, but he thought superimposed on them were long waves of 50 or 60 years. And that's always been very controversial. Paul Samuelson said it was just sort of nonsense, and he was just sort of misreading the statistics. But I think there is something to it, if not in I think in technological sense there is too. We now call them general purpose technologies, but it's basically just the same stuff. You have an industrial revolution every 50 or 70 years. But in politically as well, I think there is a long political cycle. And I think that's where there's the Polanyi double movement is a way of thinking about that. And that sort of starts you thinking, well, where are we in that movement now? So yeah, I think, ideas matter, right? I mean, I don't think they're as powerful as Keynes thought they were. But I don't know if I put it in this book, I put it in one of my other books, Milton Friedman's famous comment on the role of the economist or the man of ideas is to keep the ideas alive until a crisis comes along in which they can have an impact. I think that's important. So a lot of these critics at the time, in their own time, faded into obscurity, or some cases were killed. I mean, some of the personal stories are very dramatic. Rosa Luxemburg, Kondratiev. But in the long term, they have a big impact. For example, thanks very much for saying you like some of the obscure ones. J.C. Kumarappa, who was a guy I didn't know anything about when I started the book, who was Gandhi's economic advisor, and his sort of he completely lost the political debate in India at the time, it was a sort of pre-independence India, and they were debating how they should organize the economy once the British had left, and Nehru and the Congress Party basically thought that the Russian model, they weren't sort of blanket nationalize everything socialists, but they thought the sort of big push Stalinist model was the way ahead. Invest everything in heavy industry as quickly as you can, the sort of big bang approach. Kumarappa completely rejected that and was sort of said that India should build on its sort of ancient village communities and produce a much more sustainable economy. And he wrote these famous now because it's been rediscovered, a book called The Economy of Permanence, which reads like a sort of manifesto of the sort of modern environmental movement in some ways. So he was, he completely lost the debate in his own life, died in complete obscurity in southern India in about 1960, but has been resurrected in parts of the environmental movement now as a sort of prophet of sustainability. So, yeah, these ideas do have important, and it's very hard to predict at the time which ones are going to be important long term. That's why in the sort of modern era, I adopted a more collective approach. I did give Piketty a chapter of his own because I think the inequality debate, but that was really just to, I think he's central to the inequality debate. So that was a way of sort of telling the chapter about inequality, and it's not all about him. Whereas some of the early chapters just are devoted, most of them are devoted to one individual.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the questions I think after reading your book, if you step back for it in the long sweep of things, is whether or not economic science is capable of progress in the same way that, say, chemistry is capable of progress, or is it something different that's going on? Right.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first pieces I ever wrote for the New Yorker in 1995 or 1996 was about the crisis in economics, and it was on that exact subject. And it was at the time, it was the rise of rational expectations and real business cycle models, basically a crisis in macroeconomics, where people thought it had become entirely divorced from reality.
Yeah.
And the people who were doing that sort of modeling said, no, look, this is just science. Like Bob Lucas at Chicago and Tom Sargent, who is still at NYU all these years later. I've always been on the side that economics is a social science. I think you do make progress. There's a scientific. I'm not a complete Luddite. I don't think it's all just sort of a whitewashing capitalism. But I don't think you can remove it from its social context as well. I mean, I think let's have a look at empirical work, for example. The rise of the sort of random control trials and all that stuff. That's progress in a way. I mean, when I was in college, there was none of that. So that, you can say, well, you can make, the Angus Deaton argument that you can't generalize from one trial or whatever, but it's an advance. That whole body of literature just didn't exist. So I think economics does make progress, but I don't think it makes progress in the sense that, we're progressing towards a sort of Newton's law, which is going to hold in all context. It's the economy is a collection of sort of institutions which evolve over time. And so you would expect the sort of dynamics of the system to change with the institutions.
Yeah. Scott, you had your hand up and now it's dropped. So
yeah, I'll pass, Pete.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm okay.
Ryan.
I love a good intellectual history, and you've written one, so thank you for that. As far as people disagreeing about your book, I wonder how much of that is semantic. You describe slavery as being capitalist. Other people might not because it doesn't respect the enslaved's consent or their property rights or any of their rights. You can say the East India Company wasn't capitalist because it had that state-granted monopoly and essentially acted like a state, as you described very well. You can make a similar argument about cronyism. So people use that same word in different ways. And I wonder if that's creating any confusion or misunderstandings in the debate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point, obviously. I mean, on the, let's use slavery as an example, just because it's obviously a, huge subject. Some people have said that describing slavery as capitalism is inaccurate because, it's the Marx argument that it's a different mode of production and people don't control their own labor. Obviously, the Marxian model of capitalism is a free labor market, very much like Adam Smith. They both came out of that. But I tried not to be sort of doctrinal about it, and I sort of tried to adopt what I thought was a sort of common sense approach that if there's large scale production for profit, that is intrinsically capitalistic on the basis of private ownership. That was sort of my working definition of capitalism. And slavery was part of a large scale, the triangular trade was huge, right? I mean, it included 3 continents. And in the context of its time, the plantations were quite large scale. They were nothing like the scale of now. So it seemed to me, I didn't want to, I tried to avoid getting into arguments about what is the nature of capitalism. And you say, well, you can't avoid that in a 600-page book. So I think some of the critiques and essentially just make that argument. What do you mean? What do you mean by capitalism? And I sort of, I guess I adopted sort of Judge Potter's rule that, you know it when you see it.
were you surprised about continuity of the concerns?
Yeah, I was. I mean, I think that just
different.
show that I'm just contradicting myself a bit here because I said there's no sort of eternal laws. What I meant by that is, there's no sort of eternal laws in terms of sort of macroeconomic aggregates or whatever. But I think there are sort of eternal dynamics inside the system. There must be, because as you say, these critiques come back again and again and again. So the whole issue of inequality sort of was huge at the start of the system. Then with the rise of the unions, it sort of abated. Then the 20th century, with the rise of the Keynesian state, it abated again. But then it's come back with globalization and sort of neoliberalism. Financial crises have been an ever-present in capitalism since it began. Is that something to do with the financial system? Well, we've had lots of different versions of the financial system over the years, but it's recurred. And I think that's something to do with just the fact that investment, which is the ultimate driver of the system, is sort of forward-looking, and when expectations get disappointed, you have a crash in some way. So that's sort of integral to the system, I think. So there are these the sort of elements of it, but they sort of come up in different guises. So, it did surprise me, and even if you read. I mean, I wanted to do a chapter on. I did a chapter on the sort of Ricardian socialists prior to Marx in England, and the person I chose was William Thompson, who was actually an Irish laird. But some of the arguments he made, we were basically making a utilitarian argument for socialism, which sort of that whole debate. When I was in Oxford in the 80s and 90s, that whole debate came back with sort of Amartya Sen arguing with the utilitarians over what the sort of basis was. And it was a very similar argument in the 1820s, obviously not as sophisticated, but William Thompson produced a sort of early utilitarian argument for a sort of equal distribution of wealth, using the diminishing marginal utility of income as a sort of underlying assumption.
Yeah, I think that one of the things in reading your book that a reader would come away from is how much, even in the spite of the evolving and changing technology and institutional arrangements or whatever, there still is this thread, and it could go back even farther into more ancient philosophy, in which we are concerned with the nature of who we are, what our relationship is with others, inequality, all those kind of things. Victoria.
Thanks. So I was just wondering, as you think through all these different folks and critics and things, if you started grouping them at all, like it seems like there's a group that's always looking at, an oppressed class versus another class. It's, there's the racial distinctions, well, originally with Marx and the labor class, but Marx has been a fascination almost more, and his is escalating, not, and whereas the labor issue has almost been resolved, unions kind of took care of that. And then there clearly some system thinker critic, and Adam Smith is the system thinker, Marx is a system thinker, Polanyi is a system thinker. And so I was just wondering if you could comment on that at all, like even this Nicolay guy that you brought up, because Nicolay is the only one where you brought up time. Time is an issue. Like transactions don't happen immediately. The money might happen immediately, but institutional transactions are generational, right? So I was just wondering if you sorted any of that out when you were thinking
I mean,
about
the whole time thing, I didn't really in this, but I mean, my previous book, which was a history more of sort of free market economics, I did deal more with that sort of theoretical basis on how markets fail. This book is more general. It's really more political economy than arguments about the role of time in and things like that, and sort of economic theory. I mean, I'm interested in that, but this is a more sort of popular history book, I think. In terms of grouping the critics, I mean, it's a very good question. As I was writing the book, I didn't really. My only thought was that I don't want it just to be a litany of all left-wing critics. I wanted to include some conservatives, and I wanted to include some women, because women basically got left out of the history of capitalism, and they got left out of economics for a long time. And I wanted to include some people from different parts of the world. So that was how I thought of it. Now looking at it, and I think various people have said, how do you group them? The most interesting one didn't come from me, I don't think. Jared Bernstein, who is Biden's economic advisor, he read the book and wrote a review of it, and he said this book has got two types of critic in it. He said it's got critics of baseball and critics of zoos. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, the critics of baseball basically love the sport, but they think it's gone to hell because of the pitch clock or, the pitching too fast, whatever. It needs reforming. And, we need to go back to baseball as it was. So they're the sort of people who want to preserve some sort of capitalism. And, Keynes would be a classic example there. He thought, the system was okay, but, it had this terrible problem of spiraling into endless depressions. And then the other critics are the critics of zoos, who just have a basic moral objection to the whole system and think zoos, just innately indefensible. We shouldn't be locking up wild animals, so they want to close the zoos down and get rid of them. And they're the sort of Marx, Rosa Luxemburg school of critics. And I think that is a fair. I think that is a fair taxonomy. You'd have to add in a third group, the critics from the right, because as I said, I do paradoxically have chapters on Adam Smith and Carlyle and Friedman and Hayek also figure in the later chapters. So they would be, I would classify them as critics of capitalism in their time, as of the system of capitalism in their time. They were critics of managed capitalism in my framework.
Yeah. John, I'm very conscious that I promised you 1 hour. So if we could take one last question. So from Ryan, sorry, Taylor, but just Ryan, ask one last question, and then we'll finish up.
Yeah, this actually ties right into the baseball versus zoos dichotomy that you brought up. A few minutes ago, you mentioned moral and utilitarian arguments against capitalism. I'm just wondering if you got a sense if there's any unifying theme of capitalism's critics tending to favor either moral criticisms or utilitarian concerns, while recognizing that every thinker has a unique balance on that spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I come out of the sort of, British utilitarian tradition, basically. I mean, Keynesianism is a sort of development of utilitarianism. So my sort of personal critique would be on that aspect. But I think if you look over history, the more powerful critique has been the moral one, because I think that's the one which sort of transcends political and sort of technocratic divisions, because it just that's what gives the critiques the sort of moral and political power, I think, and it's why they come back. I mean, the critiques of the factory system in early 19th century Britain, and obviously in the US too, to a lesser extent, they had a great sort of moral power. And, the critiques of sort of surveillance capitalism and monopoly capitalism in the 21st century have a sort of, I think people find it morally repugnant. They're not arguing that, this is violating marginal conditions because, there's no sort of marginal cost there. They just think it's, that there's something morally wrong about private equity groups buying up local vets in sort of large numbers and raising the prices. That's a silly example, but it's one I'm sort of aware of because I've been taking my dog to the local vet for years, and it's just been taken over by a private equity group which has sort of jacked up the prices 100%. Yeah. So I think the moral arguments are the ones which sort of give the critique the sort of bite, even though I, as a sort of economist and as a sort of British Keynesian, am still at heart, would take a slightly more technocratic approach.
Well, John, thank you so much, and congratulations for writing such a great book. I hope it's translated into all the languages of the world and in paperback and sells great. So I think it's just a fantastic contribution to our conversation and knowledge for the day. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I much appreciated. And Peter, any other time you'd like to invite me back, I love to talk. As I said, I spent a long time on it, so it's a great thrill to me when people read it and find it valuable. Whatever.
I do think one of the big questions I had constantly reading it is, why is it that someone couldn't write as compelling a book about the defenders of capitalism? And I'm quite intrigued by this argument. I don't know the answer to that, but I don't think they're interesting people.
I guess maybe just journalistically, narratively, telling the story of the losers is, often more dramatic and than the winners. You know, I mean, if capitalism collapses and we have 100 years of socialism, then
Then we could do this. Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.